This is the Cuba most people know. Fidel Castro's Cuba, where for over 30 years the revolution has defied American intervention, standing firm under the motto, socialism or death. In Cuba today, the final battle of the Cold War is being fought with five-star hotels, catering to tourists from all over the world. With menus in English and the US dollar the official tourist currency, the Cuban Revolution has taken a fundamental turn. Those most affected are the Cuban people, whose voices are seldom heard beyond their shores. How have they survived the US embargo, fall of the Soviet bloc, and what are their hopes for the future of their revolution?
You have to learn that life changes. And at the beginning, the first 30 years, were very romantic, very idealistic. And now we have to put our toes on earth, our feet on earth, see? And try to live according to international coordinates and reality.
The United States imposed an economic embargo on Cuba in 1959 and has continued to tighten the restrictions to this day. Cuba survived by means of trade and subsidies from the Soviet bloc. With the collapse of the Soviets in 1989, Cuba faced extreme shortages in a crisis they named the Special Period.
In reality, we've always been in a crisis. Of course, we had the backing of the European Soviet bloc, which undoubtedly helped to develop the country during those decades. When the Soviet bloc fell, we faced a catastrophic situation, not only from the economic standpoint, but the ideological as well. During the new crisis, which coincided with the hardening of the U.S. blockade, well, we were forced to re-examine a lot of things.
Tengo que levantarme de madrugada, meterme en esa cola, requete condenada, ver a toda la gente empurruñada, con sueño todavía y más desayunada. Como mi jefe no come nada, si le llego tarde me descuento una tajada. Maldito viejo, cara arrugada, con ojo de cangrejo y la panza hinchada. Eso no es nada, eso no es nada, eso no es nada.
The crisis reached its peak by 1991 as widespread malnutrition led to rioting. Demonstrating his unique power as patriarch, Castro quelled the rioters by joining them. His survival skills were evident once again, as with previous migrations, Castro announced on television that anyone who wanted to leave Cuba was free to do so. And many thousands did in homemade rafts. The exodus continued nearly 3 months until a deal was struck where Castro would stop the rafters if the U.S. accepted those already on its shores. Most made it to Guantanamo or Florida. Some gave up and returned, while many died at sea. Those who remained suffered serious shortages. Milk was available only for children to age 7. Free public housing in buildings like this one, formerly owned by Cuban exiles, fell into disrepair.
Aquí, en este hotel,
here in this hotel, famous Ant Hill, there live 70 families. Among these 70 families are Orientals, that we call Palestinians, and people from Havana. We all get along, but we have problems with the water, with the collective toilet, but in spite of all this, we try to survive. We must bathe in our room. But we hope that all these things will be fixed for us in time, and God willing, all will be well.
Though the walls are crumbling and the floor is cracked, everything is remarkably clean. The utilities are jerry-built. The plumbing is broken down so the water is brought in by the bucketful, and the stove runs on kerosene. A makeshift second floor has been built into the traditional high-ceiling rooms.
In this tub, my baby and I bathe.
Cubans have had to become masters at adaptation and repair. The most notable examples are the old American cars, which Cuban mechanics have kept running despite no new parts since 1959. Everywhere you go, you see mechanics bent over a hood performing miracles at maintenance and restoration. Typical of Cuban humor, they say that the only thing worse than an old American car is a new Russian one. The U.S. embargo prevents Cuba from buying fuel on the open market. The little oil Cuba produces is heavy, high in sulfur, and burns poorly. The fuel shortage of the special period severely hurt the economy. Construction of Cuba's first nuclear power plant was halted in '89. Electricity is rationed and blackouts are common. Many crops were lost for lack of fuel to run the antiquated water pumps and tractors. The oxen has returned to the field, and much harvesting is done as it was 100 years ago. The fuel shortage has made the bicycle central to personal transportation. A system of special bicycle buses has been set up for distance commuters. Lack of fuel and raw materials has closed hundreds of factories throughout the island, putting thousands out of work. Country folk poured into Havana, squatting in slums for lack of housing.
Well, that house you just photographed demonstrates precisely the conditions. It is very old, and the people who live there are humble like millions of Cubans. They live there with all their children because they have nowhere else to go.
While lack of funds for urban renewal found some Cubans going to the street with buckets for their water, in the national interest, millions of Cuban dollars were diverted to revitalizing the grand hotels and training staff. European investors built lavish new hotels for tourists who flood in from all over the world.
My name is Andrei. I am from Russia. I am from St. Petersburg. I was very much amazed with the quality of the hotels, and I can tell you that the quality is very high. Very good service, and of course beautiful weather. So to say.
I'm from Canada, and I've been in Vera for 3 days, and I love it.
These new luxury hotels are no less expensive than anywhere else in the world, causing some Cubans to joke that now they live in a third world country with Parisian prices. However, visitors to Cuba, like this group of Italians, come not only for pleasure, but for business. Foreign investments have started to revive agriculture, as well as mining for Cuba's rich nickel reserves. And low-cost, high-quality medical care attracts thousands of visitors annually. The influx of tourism and foreign investment has opened a floodgate of desperately needed hard currencies. New government policies have sought to revitalize the local economy by granting licenses for over 150 types of private enterprises. Independent farmers who can sell at market prices are replacing communist collectives. A variety of merchants and vendors have sprung up like mushrooms under economic liberalization, and a service economy has blossomed.
In the first place, the possession of certain currencies, strong currencies, has been liberalized, which before people were not permitted to hold. Secondly, there was a liberalization of consumer services to invigorate other sectors of the economy in order to bring about a dynamism in Cuban society.
Independent growers jam markets like this one with many products unavailable under the planned economy system.
The prices are high. Pork is 36 pesos, sometimes 40 a pound.
There is some resentment spreading, for the prices at such free markets are beyond the reach of most peso-earning Cubans. In Cuba today, there are two distinct economies, the peso economy and the dollar economy. A taxi driver can earn $5 just driving a tourist across town. But $5 would be the equivalent of a month's wages for a Cuban worker earning pesos. These Cubans ride the El Camello, the camel, a massive diesel truck holding about 200 people, charging a few cents. Imported beer would be a luxury to a peso holder. He must get along on his allotment of rationed rum. If you shop with pesos, the stores are mostly barren of even necessities like soap, cooking oil, and meat. Amid such scarcity, all Cubans must carry a ration book, allocating their basic commodities. Although conditions have improved since the beginning of the special period, food supplies vary widely and unpredictably. Consumer goods stores are largely empty of products and customers. But with dollars, you can shop in stores like this one and buy anything from designer clothes to appliances. Known as dollar stores, the shelves are stocked with products from all over the world. Despite the embargo, with dollars, even American products are available. Castro, by permitting a market economy, foreign investment, and the free circulation of the U.S. dollar, created a basic contradiction with communist ideology.
There is a great concern amongst revolutionary intellectuals that they're not prosper in the country, that attitude of to each his own. You know, anything to make money, to simply resolve the present problem.
While doctrinaire Marxists lament the rise of free enterprise, these new Cuban entrepreneurs welcome the opportunity to improve their living standards. Private restaurants are one of the most common new businesses. They are licensed by the government and tax-paying. Called paladars, they are usually operated in homes and are family-run. Accepting only dollars, menus range from pizzerias to elegant dining.
Esto es mi casa.
This is my house. As you can see behind me, it doesn't look like a house. Because of its characteristics, size, and charm, I have made it into a paladar. A paladar is a small restaurant. Undoubtedly, this is a recourse we have taken to improve our economic conditions.
This old home houses 3 families and the paladar upstairs, a rental unit downstairs, and a car repair shop in the backyard.
My husband and I are doctors, and even though the salary is, among professionals, one of the best, because of the economic conditions of this country, our income is not sufficient to maintain the lifestyle that we seek.
By appealing to tourists and businessmen, more Cubans have access to dollars. Some artists and entertainers can earn more than a doctor.
There is a concern that to appeal to the tourist market, the artists do not commercialize their creativity. There is also a very serious concern that the authentic cultural message not be corrupted by an attempt to achieve the widest sales that will offer the most money.
The coupling of Cuba's communism with the economic reforms of free enterprise is a marriage of irreconcilable differences. On the cusp of the 21st century, Cuba finds herself in a state of flux. Will the reforms that promise to save Cuba's economy destroy the ideals of the revolution she has fought so long to protect? The average Cuban on the island has suffered extreme shortages and hard times, but their spirit and faith in the revolutionary ideals has sustained them. American policymakers have never understood Cuban patriotism and pride in the achievements of the revolution. Cuban youth know nothing other than revolutionary times. Fidel Castro has been in office longer than 9 American presidents, each of which has tried to overthrow him. However, in spite of Castro's influence and longevity, one must place him in the proper historical context. The Cuban quest for independence and social justice preceded him by a century.
A revolution, a real revolution, is not a coup d'etat, it's not a change of parties, it's not a change of presidents. It is something that comes up from the very roots of the nation, of the people that wants to be a nation.
Settled by Christopher Columbus in 1492, Cuba was a prized and strategic colony of Spain for 400 years. The American Revolution against England was an inspiration to Cuba, as well as all of Latin America, where the republican form of government became the common model. The United States assumed the role of protector of these new republics with the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. The George Washington of the Cuban struggle for independence was José Martí. The well-known poet and journalist became Cuba's quintessential patriot.
Le digo que para caracterizar.
I say that to understand this Cuban revolution, you must start with José Martí, not Karl Marx or Lenin. It's Martí. Martí said that even if you graft the whole world onto our republic, the stem is Cuban and the trunk is Martí. Everything else is only a graft.
Cubans compare Martí to Abraham Lincoln for his beliefs in liberty, justice, and equality among the races. You will not find statues to Marx, Lenin, or even Fidel Castro in Cuba, only Martí. In the early 1880s, Martí went to the United States seeking support for the revolution. There he found that proponents of Manifest Destiny were pushing for a global expansion of American power. He realized that a move against Spain was inevitable because of her strategic territories. American journalism promoted hostility toward Spain, siding with Cuba's battle for independence. When American agents stopped a shipload of arms headed for Cuban patriots, Martí became convinced that America had its own agenda for Cuba.
Martí's writings from that time on were focused on the theme that since the rise of superpowers could not be avoided, we should make efforts to create a balance of power so that no one nation could dominate the weaker states. This fear was realized in this 20th century.
Martí returned to Cuba, where he died in combat in 1895. By the late 1890s, after years of bloody battles, the Spaniards were finally losing control to the Cuban patriots. School children celebrate annually the Spanish agreement to withdraw. At last, Cuba would be free. But this was not to be. In 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine sailed into Havana Harbor, where it exploded and sank. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," cried the American press. President McKinley declared war. As part of the global battle plan, future President Teddy Roosevelt rode with the Rough Riders into Cuba, while halfway around the world, Admiral Dewey sailed the Great White Fleet into Manila Harbor and sank the bulk of the Spanish fleet in a surprise attack. The so-called Splendid Little War lasted only 10 weeks. Without any representation, Cuba was ceded to the United States along with the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Once the model of liberty and justice, America now changed in the Cuban perspective. As stated by Congressman Cisneros, the United States faced inevitable decline due to the abandonment of the principles of its founding fathers. Cubans felt robbed of their revolution. Their history portrays America not as a defender, but as an aggressor. Cubans also remember the Maine, with a monument in Havana which reads, "To the victims of the Maine who were sacrificed by voracious imperialism in its effort to seize control of the island of Cuba."
Cuba for 50 years, more than 50 years, was a colony of the United States.
The American military governor presided over Cuba's first presidential election. The new Cuban Constitution provided the right for the United States to intervene in Cuban internal affairs, and a perpetual lease was granted for a U.S. naval base at Guantanamo. American companies invested heavily in agricultural, mining, and commerce, making Cuba an American economic dependency. By the 1950s, in alliance with the American mob, Cuba was a playground with casinos and resorts where any imaginable vice was available. Batista, who came to power as a reformer, became a friend of powerful Americans. For the lucky few, life was very pleasant. But for the mass majority, conditions were deplorable. Starvation wages prevailed, forcing most to live in terrible slums without sanitation, health care, or schools. Many Cubans resented the presence of American forces who were notorious on shore leave and viewed them as supporters of Batista. Cubans will never forget the insult in which an American sailor climbed up and urinated on a statue of José Martí. When the American ambassador apologized for the incident, he could not remember the name of Cuba's most cherished hero.
I want to take this occasion to apologize to the Cuban people on behalf of the American people for the incident that happened last evening at the desecration of the monument of Cut.
We are a people of Spanish descent, which means we're proud individually and loyal to our group. We can put up with anything, endure anything, except humiliation.
But the Batista regime preferred profits over patriotism, and corruption grew unchecked. Widespread opposition to Batista was growing at all levels. From wealthy landowners to slum dwellers, a revolutionary movement was emerging, and university students in Havana were a focal point. Among these was a young law student named Fidel Castro. Stubborn and charismatic, he rose to lead his own revolutionary group. After a short prison term for leading a disastrous raid on the Moncada barracks, Castro was exiled to Mexico. There he regrouped and returned to Cuba with a small band of revolutionaries, taking refuge in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Celebrated for his quest to bring social justice to Cuba, Castro became a local folk hero, and support poured in from abroad. All the other rebel leaders died in the struggle, leaving Castro as undisputed leader of the revolution. With support for the revolution growing abroad and in the United States, the American government recommended to Batista that he leave, which he did immediately. The rebels swept into Havana in midst of universal acclaim. While too young to be president, Fidel Castro became the power behind the new government. In America, Castro was welcomed as a chief of state. He reassured everyone about his democratic sentiments. Historical opinions differ over Castro's political ideology at this point. No one who knew him guessed that he was anything other than a democratic reformer. The administration of Eisenhower made a genuine effort to reach an understanding with the leader of the Cuban Revolution. During his first visit to the U.S., in a major speech, Castro solemnly announced that he was not a communist. The revolution saw land reform as a fundamental demand of the people. Upon achieving power, Castro initiated distribution of land to poor farm workers. Progressively, huge land estates were expropriated, including the sugar fields of the Cuban rich and foreign companies. This turn in the revolution alarmed not only wealthy Cubans, but President Eisenhower, who ordered a reduction of sugar purchases by the United States in retaliation. With the Soviets offering to buy anything the U.S. might embargo, Fidel Castro for the first time professed communism. Though the Russians had their doubts, the Soviet-Cuban alliance was born. In March 1960, a Belgian ship loaded with arms exploded in Havana harbor, causing massive damage and loss of life. This was the first of hundreds of acts of sabotage aimed at removing Castro, mostly coordinated by the CIA under the top-secret operation called Mongoose. With American support, exiles routinely overflew Cuba, dropping leaflets, equipment, and agents. A U.S. military plane flown by Cuban exiles was shot down, confirming reports that the CIA was training exiles in Guatemala and in the U.S. Castro predicted that a full-scale invasion was imminent. Men, women, and children were quickly mobilized. At dawn, April 17, 1961, a force of 1,500 Cuban exiles landed on Cuba's southern shore. News of the attack had been leaked. Kennedy, seeking to hide American involvement, ordered the denial of U.S. air support. The CIA prediction of a Cuban uprising in support of the invasion proved to be false, and within days the attack was crushed. The 1,200 survivors were exchanged for $53 million worth of medicine and food. After the Bay of Pigs, Castro instituted a state of perpetual tactical alert. With continued American public threats, Castro felt justified accepting Soviet missiles in 1962. The world faced a nuclear war. The Russians withdrew their missiles in return for America's pledge to not invade Cuba again. Doubting the American pledge, bomb shelters and bunkers were tunneled throughout Cuba, stocked with Russian weaponry, medical supplies, and food. These tunnels, some running for miles, are jokingly called the subway. Urban blocks have an elected committee for the defense of the revolution. These committees oversee every aspect of ordinary life. At notice of a crisis, every adult has an assigned task and reports for duty.
All the people have weapons. Even our women have military training, and they shoot. So don't think about invading us, because we will make you look ridiculous as we did before. If you come again, you would pay dearly. You don't have enough coffins in the United States for your casualties. For here, we have fighters, a surplus.
Some argue that the continuous hostile activities of the U.S. government and Cuban exiles make Castro appear indispensable to the people. Public memorials and museums document the history and keep the anti-revolutionary threat ever present. And television delivers the party line.
On Saturday, February 24, 1996, pirate aircraft coming from their base in Opalaca, in the south of the state of Florida, violated the airspace of the Republic of Cuba, north of the city of Havana. Such a deed is not new.
The tragic overflights of 1996 were aimed at disrupting a historical meeting between Cuban officials and critics of the regime, convened to explore the expansion of political expression. For this reason, the United Nations refused to condemn Cuba, though it deplored the loss of life.
We believe
that the future leadership of Cuban society is not abroad now. Although the exiles are as Cuban as we are, be they in Spain or the United States, I do not believe that the leadership of this island depends upon them.
There has not been a revolution in Cuba for 30 years. That is to say, at this time, if our system were so contrary to democratic principles, or despotic as it is portrayed daily on television all over the world, there would have been 30 revolutions.
But is the revolution in Cuba today the revolution for liberty and democracy of José Martí?
Beyond what might be the acceptance of a political ideology, like communism, the ideology which our government would propose today as valid, it would be hard to find a Cuban that would not feel that the philosophy and values of Martí are valid, just, and fundamental.
As one party official stated off the record, we are good revolutionaries but bad communists. Would rather go dancing than to a party meeting. Orthodox Marxists wrestle with the contradiction.
The renovated socialism we are developing, without dogma or bureaucracy, it will be based on Marx, Lenin, and Engels. Poor Marx. Everyone blames him for the terrible things Stalin did. It's a chronological problem, no?
Critics question the validity of Cuba's elections with only one party presenting candidates.
Our political system, for all its faults, some of which are being corrected and others which our generation must address, nonetheless has a consensus of the people.
One thing Cubans agree upon is opposition to U.S. domination. Anti-American rallies are common. Yet Cubans separate American politics from American culture, which is celebrated openly. They watch U.S. television and obtain popular videos and music. American celebrities in sports, music, and cinema are well known.
I am not in agreement with the Grammy Awards because Mariah Carey should have got the award for the best song of the year. Because of that song, she sang with the group Boyz II Men.
I want everybody to know that, like me, I am a Cuban writer, like me, many other Cubans, thousands and thousands of Cubans, love the American people, admire the American people and the American culture. So we have nothing against the people, you see? Our problem, our contradiction is with the White House.
Anti-American sentiment focuses largely on the U.S. embargo, which the Cuban refer to as a blockade dating to 1959. The Helms-Burton Law is the most recent escalation of the embargo. This new law permits suing in American courts anyone doing business on expropriated Cuban properties worth more than $50,000 when seized. Provisions in the law permit circumventing the embargo by means of private settlements with the defendants. While proposing to tighten the noose on Fidel Castro, it potentially will bring millions to wealthy special interests. The vast majority of Cuban exiles are excluded from any benefits. The Helms-Burton Law has been denounced globally as a violation of international agreements. Foreign investors, like Spaniards, who now dominate the international distribution of Cuban cigars, are appalled by this unprecedented extraterritorial measure. The European Union vowed to retaliate if the law were implemented. NAFTA is threatened by this restraint of trade as well. But those who stand to suffer the most are the Cuban workers. Having barely survived the special period, any drop in production could be a mortal blow.
The blockade does not hurt us at all. Not even a bit. Because we have the ability to endure. The U.S. is hurting itself with the blockade. Before the whole world, they are raising our stature. For when you see a giant beat up on a child, everyone goes for the child.
But how far must the people go to endure? Despite the suppression of prostitution for a generation, economic hardships of the special period explain the return of the profession. The development of such social problems has only increased Cuban defiance of American policy, which they blame for their new hardships.
I would ask how you would like it if your children had no milk, food, or candies like chocolates that children love so much. You close off our children from these things.
My grandchildren haven't had dessert for 3 months.
It's not right. Leave us alone. If you believe that all this is so bad or chaotic, then take away the blockade and let us see whether this is bad or good.
The effects of the blockade on the people are generally very bad. It hurts us not only materially, it hurts us in health, it hurts us in nutrition, but it also hurts us psychologically. We could say that it is a crime against humanity that we have suffered since almost the start of the revolution. Our foreign minister, Robina, for the first time in history, has managed to convene the United Nations General Assembly to discuss the Cuba-U.S. question. There you have it. Leave us alone. We want to live in peace. We want our revolution and our achievements. Let the people around who have heard me respond.
Shortages of all kinds abound. Kids on the street approaching a tourist don't ask for money. They ask for pencils for school. The economic embargo was expanded to cut off medical supplies as well. Basic items such as thermometers are scarce in children's hospitals. Even can buy medical supplies, which the U.S. denies to Cuba.
Well, due to the blockade, in many cases we find it impossible to acquire equipment as well as materials for diagnosis and also treatment.
Unable to afford new containers, Cuban doctors improvise, as shown by the sterilization and reuse of bottles.
We gather these by the thousands and use them over and over again until they fall on the floor and break.
This is an AIDS clinic in Matanzas province, where, like others in Cuba, this epidemic appears to be largely contained.
I am Barbara Morgan. I'm married. My husband was an internationalist, and it was through him that I contracted HIV.
When we started to monitor AIDS in 86 to 89, the first cases were, of the vast percentage, found among our international volunteers who contracted HIV in Africa. Now it is the opposite. Most of the AIDS problem is homegrown.
It was determined that not all the HIV infected need be hospitalized and could be treated as outpatients in sanatoriums in conjunction with their family doctor. The sanatoriums were directed to teaching how to live with AIDS and protect the health of others.
In the sanatorium, we breathe an air of informality. A visitor couldn't tell a staff member from a patient. Today, we're having a championship domino game.
Since most pharmaceutical firms are transnational, Cuba is forced to buy medical supplies and equipment as far away as Japan and China at 5 times the normal cost.
Here we had a very good technology, Western technology. But due to the blockade, we had to change to another technology. Then when the Eastern Bloc fell apart, we have had to resort to still other sources. This is very expensive for a small, poor country. However, we have the best and greatest resource any country can have. Dignity. That's for certain. Dignity and character. Thus we shall endure and be victorious.
But how are the goals of the revolution expressed among Cuban youth, which is more influenced by American rock and roll than by Marx? Will this generation raised with hunger remain loyal to the revolution? For Cubans who remember conditions before the revolution, it's a different game. In spite of the hardships of the special period, most older Cubans believe the quality of life is generally better.
Many people who lived in virtual favelas now live in normal houses, like this one, and some smaller, but they live decently.
We want to create our own society for a better man. Not a new man, that's a utopia. A better man. A man that would have a possibility for social security, a possibility for public health, for free education, as we have been able to give to the people of Cuba up to now. We don't want to lose that.
Cubans take great pride in the achievement of their public health system, which covers about 96% of the population. The local family doctor is the heart of this system. Doctors and a nurse live in apartments within the local clinic, making them available anytime for the people in their district. Basic equipment serves for preventive care, diagnosis, and general medical needs. The mostly young family doctors know everyone in their service area.
How do you feel?
The only thing that bothers me now is the hernia that I have.
Soon you will be finished with 109, so you'll be 110. How do you eat?
Well,
how do you sleep?
Terribly.
Let me take your blood pressure.
Upon referral by a family doctor, specialized care is available in centers like this children's hospital. Despite the shortages, the infant mortality rate in Cuba is as good as that of the United States. The quality of Cuban health care attracts people from abroad. Women have equal access to medical training and research. In a former middle-class beach resort, there is a unique facility for the young victims of Chernobyl, who suffer from a variety of cancers due to radiation poisoning.
Расскажите мне хоть раз, что такое фантомас? Может, это чародей, может, это смех людей. Бум-бум, люди, ква-ква-кварель. Шара-каравелла, най-най-най. Шара-каравелла, най-най-най. А шара-каравелла, шалула. Парень девушку.
Children come with their parents at Cuban expense.
You see, the matter is I'm going from Ukraine in Vinnytsia city. I came there together with my daughter. She's ill, and I'm persuaded, and in some months she will be better.
Приду сейчас домой, а старик мой фантомас.
One of the first programs of the revolution was a national literacy campaign. Volunteer teachers were sent to the most remote corners of the island. Today, Cuba boasts of a literacy rate of 94%, exceeding any country in Latin America. The national goals include literate and healthy youth, loyal to the revolution. Schools feed and care for the health of children. Cubans believe that the revolution has made its biggest investment in human resources. While physical conditions vary in the countryside, the curriculum and materials are standard. Compared to a handful of universities before 1959, Cuba now boasts 35 universities and institutes of higher education. Attendance is free for those who qualify. In return, upon graduation, students must select a job for 2 years in public service. This system has produced an army of engineers, doctors, researchers, and technicians, many of which go to work abroad. In recent years, standards have been raised sharply to achieve a level of global competitiveness. The resurgence of religion in recent years, especially among the youth, is an interesting development for a communist society. Religious groups originally supported the revolution, but broke away when Marxism was established. The influence of liberation theology in Latin America, which argued for social justice, convinced the Castro regime that there was no essential conflict between religious faith and revolutionary goals. Castro has said that if he were the only one left who believed in the revolution, he would continue. Socialism or death remains his motto. Thus, the propaganda of the revolution and indoctrination continues. But you can't eat slogans. Tourism and a free market economy, while saving the day, have started the end of orthodox Marxism. Some suggest that Castro is slowly dismantling his system in Cuba, making the transition gradual to avoid the chaos that followed the breakdown of communism in Eastern Europe. Listening to the voices of Cuba, we hear many things not understood abroad. Commonly depicted as a Marxist tyranny, few Cubans see themselves as communists, but identify themselves as revolutionaries. To understand Cubans, one must understand this distinction. They see their revolution as a continuing process, which someday soon will implement Martí's ideas for not only a socially just society, but a democratic society. Though the U.S. embargo failed to remove Castro from office, it has forced him to liberalize the economy. This has many Cubans thinking that American economic domination may soon be a thing of the past. And now that the international business community is welcoming Cuba into the game, she believes she may soon achieve the independence she has fought for so long. But the fight isn't over yet. Though reforms have begun, Cuba suffers from the same deficit and decay as seen in other failed communist economies. Still, the U.S. continues to tighten its embargo. Cubans ask why the U.S. has over the years traded extensively with other communist regimes like the Soviet Union, China, and Vietnam. Many Americans question the embargo as well. The United Nations has denounced the U.S. embargo as a violation of international trade laws and human rights.
When this story is told, we shall see how many reasons we have for neighborliness and good relations. Many are the Cubans and North Americans that have contributed in the fields of science, art, and culture to forge a common history. I vote for and send personal good wishes not only to my colleagues, but to the whole American public that has a special place in our heart.
I cannot presume to address the American people, but assuming that it is a believing people for the most part, and essentially Christian, I think that they could start, as we had to do in Cuba, by reviewing the scriptures. They would see that from the earliest prophets to the Acts of the Apostles, the essential and enduring theme is social justice.
Basically, we hope that the U.S. reflects on its relations with its neighbor that has great problems. However, its problems have a domestic solution.
And I think the American government should know that what they must do is help us in this campaign, in this idea. But what they do is the contrary. They try to, embargo and strangle Cuban people, and that's not the way to really establish a good relationship, a fair relationship. We want a fair relationship. We need respect. That's all.